The 1920s by Sam Neves. The Roaring Twenties featured some of the most profound economic prosperity and carefree living of that time, such as the development of cities, cars, radios, telephones, stocks, new social trends and music, the growth in industry, and the growth of the nation. The Roaring Twenties weren't all that roaring. Roaring is what it started with, but ended in a crash. Moving to the city was a new thing. Because of the second industrial movement, this was a time of interchangeable parts, the assembly line, and new technologies such as the telephone, automobile, and electrification of homes and businesses. Now this industrial revolution was taking place in towns and cities, not on the countryside, and people were drawn, so much that by the 1920s, 25 million immigrants came to the United States. There were great pull factors and not many push factors, such as the development of cities where music and shows were at the center of entertainment, which was the cause of so many people immigrating, not to mention speakeasies. But with many people, many jobs were needed, and the place to go was the factories, where the job competition was high with immigrants. Manufacturing was the wave of the century. Some of the best examples of mass production through manufacturing are the big three car companies at that time, Ford, Chrysler, General Motors. What made these three car companies boom was Henry Ford, who created the assembly line, which advanced the production rates of goods more cheaply, making the Ford Model T car the best known and most widely bought car of its time. This wasn't the only radical change occurring. Radical change and so-called rebellion in the eyes of traditionalists, also called flappers, a young woman with bobbed hair and short skirts who drank, smoked, and said what they considered unladylike things, such as being more sexually free. They were considered individuals who dressed, said, and did what they wanted. It was a movement that was moving away from the confines of the traditional views of that time, like getting married, having kids, or living what was considered a normal life at that time. That was not the only thing that was contradictory in the minds of individuals. Another radical change at hand was the 18th Amendment, probably one of the most controversial decisions made by Congress during the 20th century. It banned the manufacturing, transportation, and sales of intoxicating liquors. Although this amendment existed, did not mean it was followed. Congress struggled to enforce this, which led to rebellion. Although at first there was a 30% drop in the consumption of alcohol, new ways were discovered to drink. Speakeasies were created, where people desired to drink could enter these nightclubs that sold alcohol and drink all they want. A man who lived during this time was Al Capone. He lived in Chicago. He was a gangster who owned well over $60 million annually from bootleg operations and speakeasies. Raised violence, where eliminating anyone whose contrary was eliminated to keep his business afloat. Now, soon Prohibition ended, once Congress realized that the amendment was doing nothing but furthering the encouragement of more drinking, violence, and rebellion. A sense of rebellion continued against the African Americans as well, dating back to the 19th century when the 14th Amendment was signed. African Americans have since then been treated poorly compared to the average Caucasian citizen. Discrimination was prominent amongst the Ku Klux Klan, also known as the KKK, which viewed African Americans and Caucasian Americans could never be equal. Although African American community was facing adversity, that did not stop them from growing during the 1920s. African American students were able to establish fraternities and sororities on college campuses. There are also new organizations being established, such as the NAACP, to support the African Americans in the fight for equality. African American politicians were being elected as well, including new authors from the African American community, like Anna Julia Cooper, and poets such as Paul Laurence Dunbar. Also, in the world of sports, a famous player by the name of Jackie Robinson was the first African American to play Major League Baseball amongst the Caucasian community. Those weren't the only things that were going the way for the African American community. The Roaring Twenties was synonymous with the Jazz Age and the Harlem Renaissance, where new music was introduced by African American musicians like Joe King Oliver, Louis Armstrong, Earl Hines, and many more like them, brought a new field of music. an escape from the regular everyday confines of life and a new renaissance of culture and music. The stock market, a place where people could make quick money and never look back. The people of that day bought stocks in unprecedented fashions. It was a new fad. There was nothing like participating in the stock market during the 1920s. The 1920s was a time of buy now, pay later, with the introduction of credit cards. What was causing the stock market to grow was the cause of the crash, also known as the stock market crash, on October 29, 1929, also known as Black Tuesday, hit Wall Street as investors traded some 16 million shares on the New York Stock Exchange in a single day. Billions of dollars were lost. The rest of the industrialized Roaring Twenties spiraled down into the Great Depression, which lasted up to 1939, making it the deepest and longest lasting economic downturn in the history of Western industrialized world up to that time. This economic tragedy ended up in mass unemployment, where 5 million people were unemployed. Now, although the decade ended in a downward spiral of events that can't fog the great accomplishments and achievements of the early years of that decade, progress was made for the betterment of the whole country. New technologies to improve the way we live, new machinery and jobs available to the workforce, cars at an affordable price for the modern-day civilian, a new mindset adopted among women to be whatever they wanted with the introduction of flappers, a rebellion against the government when the 19th Amendment was created with the forming of speakeasies and the rise of Al Capone and the Mafia. African Americans dealt with discrimination amongst all kinds of groups of people, including the KKK, but great progress was made in the fight for equality, with the NAACP paving a way to ensure the political, educational, social, and economic equality of rights for all persons, including African Americans, and the elimination of race-based discrimination. African Americans also introduced jazz and brought the Harlem Renaissance as an escape from the stock market crash in 1929. Although this time was extremely difficult to overcome, they soon did in the near future, but we'll talk about that on next time in the decades of the 20th century.